With the release of OP11 and also the updated ban list happening on April 1st, the meta as we've seen develop has been super interesting going on in the East. This is the tier list prediction that we made before the start of the EBO2 meta and before the Japan finals, and obviously with the introduction of OP11, there's some changes that we have to make to this. Now, apologies that this didn't come before the start of OP11. I was in the process of quitting my job. As of now, I'm a full-time content creator, so appreciate all of your support, especially on the last couple of videos. If you want to support the channel, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Type in the comments of how you feel about my specific tier list and be nice about it. Don't be evil. Okay, so looking at this tier list right off the bat, there's a couple things that we have to address. One, I think a lot of people did not predict, at least at the start of the EBO2 meta before the Japan finals, that Green Purple Luffy was going to be a tier 1 top deck. It has been such a cool surprise. The deck is super dominant, right? On paper, may not look super great, but with that ability to constantly reutilize Dawn, become a 6,000 power leader, has just put it above so many other decks and really hurdled itself as, like, in my opinion, a top 2 deck in the format. But let's go ahead and look at the other decks that are going on, at least that I previously had in tier 1. Marshall D. Teach, I think, is still a really good deck. Right, it's still a deck that you have to worry about in the format. Just the ability to stop on play effects, which have been so prevalent in so many decks for so long. Not a lot of decks have adjusted to it, and sometimes, although it does struggle against some of the top level decks, and another one that we'll get to later, you oftentimes beat a lot of the other random stuff, I think, as Marshall D. Teach, because many decks revolve around the idea of on play. You still have your problems though, and there is a chance that I think it may go into the 2.5, but for now I think I'm going to leave it at the tier 2, and I'll explain why I have that weird feeling later. Doflamingo, I think, also is a pretty good deck. I think Doflamingo though may go down to the 2.5 after the ban. I still think Doflamingo is good even without Jinbei, but I think Josh kind of summarized it really well, Real Joshua, saying along the lines that blue has lost such an insane level of aggression without Jinbei in the deck. Now, Doflamingo still has many strengths, like being able to spam characters on the board with the leader effect, as well as have really good removal in the 4-drop Law, the 6-drop Jozu, and Gravity Blade Redrock as events. It's still one you need to watch out for, but I think one that gets heavily nerfed not only by the ban list, but the new upcoming tier 1 decks. Black Yellow Luffy though, I think it falls off kind of the face of the earth in there. I don't even know if it's tier 3. I mean, if you look at just the different results week by week before even the ban list, I think, is enacted, it's crazy to see how nobody is playing any more Black Yellow Luffy. It's almost like it's fallen off. Now, this is an Eastern prediction, and maybe the West will continue to cope and maybe bring it back on the map in a sense, but I definitely think that, especially heading into this OP11 meta, it's a fraction of what it was, especially as some of the decks, the amount of bodies that they can produce, the amount of power that they can produce every single turn is just something that Black Yellow Luffy can't deal with in the long term. Enel, I think, also moves down into the tier 3 category, especially with the ban of Raigo, right? Raigo being such a huge part of Enel's game plan, but Enel can do a lot of other great things against several other decks that are still around in the format, right? Being able to check a couple different ones, like some of the red aggro decks that we've got going around, as well as Doflamingo. Being able to starve out your opponents can be just that great of a strategy, but without having that removal piece, right, to get rid of the huge, gigantic boss monster bodies that are roaming around in the format, you can get overwhelmed as Enel. Zoro, I think, also moves up in the tier 2 category, right? The Zoro deck, as its claim, has definitely gotten a huge surge, especially with the post ban list and OP11 releasing, you'll start to see a lot of aggro decks move up in general in the format. And I'm talking about quick, aggressive aggro decks, like some of the fastest decks in the game. And Zoro is kind of the king of all of those aggro decks, in my opinion. That leader effect, even though so simple since OP01, just giving everything a natural 1000 power boost, just provides so many benefits and can utilize so many different bodies so much earlier, right? Even though you don't have like Dawn ramping manipulation and things like that. I think Bello Betty also moves up in the tier 2 list. I think Bello Betty has a really good matchup against some of the top decks that we're going to talk about later in the video alongside Green Purple Luffy. Just like Zoro, right? Being able to just knock down and outrun your opponent so quickly. Marshall D. Teach Wright is notorious for this, of just being flat out destroyed because of these hyper aggressive wide matchups. Bello Betty and Zoro are kind of at the top of these aggro decks that have really started to rise out in Japan, but the reason that I've considered them tier 2 in comparison to Green Purple Luffy, right, with Green Purple Luffy also being a tier 1 deck, even though I would say they have a similar number of results. Why am I separating them in two categories? I think something like Green Purple Luffy is more of a meta defining deck, right? These picks are more so counter picks to those top level meta decks. So I think that if, you know, the top decks, and we'll get to the other ones soon, of these existing, if they didn't exist, then these wouldn't have as much of success, I think. And I think we're seeing that play a little bit in 10, at least in the Western format. We'll get to a Western format later, though. I want to test a little bit more and do the Western format a little bit closer to Pasadena, right, happening on about April 12th. So probably about that week of April 6th is when I'll release the Western version of the OP10 post-ban list tier list. Speaking of aggro decks, I think honestly Luffy, SD21 Luffy, it's probably hanging out in the tier 3 cope category. It's definitely not YouTube bait, I think, at this point, but there are some strategies that are coming out both in the West and also in the East, especially in Japan, that we're starting to see run around in some flagships that may not just be a joke. I'm not sure. It still needs a little bit of a jump, in my opinion, but being able to have decent matchups with a lot of the top decks, just like Zoro and Bello Betty, give it a lot of aggression in this upcoming format. It's really interesting seeing this grow, especially with some of the bonkers cards that come in the starter deck 21 deck. I'm talking like that Luffy, right? The Zoro is pretty good. People are loving the Zoro out in the West. That Sanji 2K is pretty good. There's a lot of interesting spots. I'm also going to move my beloved Red Yellow Sabo up here as well. It's starting to get some results out in Japan. And just like I said with some of these other decks, just red aggressive decks are on the up. You're going to see me move some more here in this video, but Red Yellow Sabo, right? Being able to use that starter deck 13 package with the 3 brothers, as well as getting access to several rush effects and maybe some revolutionary army style gameplay, just bodes well for it and puts it in the real cope category for me. And honestly, Christmas came early this year for Red Green Chopper fans, because Chopper, I genuinely think it's also part of this like aggressive decks coming up category, right? Being able to essentially have a Zoro package, but reutilizing Dawn is so valuable for our little beloved doctor. I think it's definitely a step below of Zoro, though, being a 4-life leader, right? 4-life leaders, definitely not as strong as some of their 5-life counterparts, but still an extremely viable pick that I think is really starting to get legs. I'll go ahead and pay my respects to Smoker. I think Smoker, especially after the Japan final, really surprised a lot of people, and especially with the strategy that the player used to win the Japan final, has really caught on both on the East and the West. There are so many more Red-Green Smoker players after that final than there were previously. Red-Green Smoker's really good, right? Being able to utilize protection effects, reutilizing Dawn, right? Restanding them and then using them for other things. 8-drop Eustace Captain Kidd. This deck is dangerous and one that is really cool to build if you've got the pieces. So I would consider it in kind of this tier 2 category, and don't worry, I'll move around some of this tier 2 stuff soon. I'm gonna go ahead and do a little bit of cleanup in here. So Iceberg, Perona, Yamato, Rebecca, Buggy, Vegapunk, Foxy, Robin, Gecko, I would say. They all go in YouTube bait, right? I think especially with the dominance of some of the top decks that we're getting, these decks just can't really survive. And it hurts me to say it, right, as a big fan of Iceberg and Robin, but I have to be a little bit realistic. I know Cross, though, has been cooking up Perona. I don't know how well it does in 11, but at least in 10, it might stick in that category. I think I also got to put Black Purple Luffy in the YouTube bait category as well, especially with Gecko gone. Like, man, I just really don't know what that deck has going for it, right? Like being able to bring back something like the Blocker Frankie or some other really powerful pieces in the Gecko Moria deck now don't have that at all. And also with the loss of something like Ice Age, right? Being able to remove bodies if you're a more removal heavy focused deck, right? Just got way harder in a sense. So I don't really see it for Purple Black Luffy. I will though move Reiju into the 2.5 top cut squeakers, especially with the aggression that's been going on. I think it's kind of on the lower end in a sense, maybe not like these three, but it's on the lower end of some of the aggressive decks that are going on in the format. I think Reiju is really interesting as well with some of the pieces that it got recently in OP11, and I think that there's something there in keeping this deck viable, but there's still something holding it back. There's a lot of testing. I know there's a couple players in Japan that are doing pretty well with it, but it hasn't really caught steam for the rest of the way. So we'll just have to wait and see if it can eventually make its move. I feel like I also want to put Marco up in the 2.5 list. Marco has a really good matchup in some of the top decks that we've got going on. And don't worry, I'll talk about the OP11 decks very soon. I kind of want to do that last after I move all the existing decks. Marco just being able to do the whole minus 2000 power to something and then play another thing down, utilize and abuse the 9-cost Sanji engine is so strong, right? Being able to, on a 10-Dawn turn, minus 2000 something, and then go Sanji into Silver's Rayleigh 8-drop to minus 3000, 2000, and then KO something can be insanely good, right? And be so good at being able to combat these kind of swarm decks that are going on, especially in the late game of other 9-cost Sanji engines. I think Marco is a sleeper pick going on right now, and who knows with Starter Deck 22 coming out if that changes anything. I know some people are really excited about some of the other Starter Deck 2020, 2022, 2020 Starter Deck 22 pieces coming with the Whitebeard Pirates in blue, and there's no better benefit to blue Whitebeard Pirates than this Marco right here. I also got to move Nami down into tier 3. Nami's having a little bit of success, but especially with some of the top decks going on right now, just being able, and especially, man, with the swarm that's coming in, like you talk about these 3 decks right here could give it problems, as well as Bello Betty and Zoro, some of the worst matchups, and Blackbeard still existing. It's not a strong spot for Nami, and you definitely need to dodge a lot of matchups, but you still have some good matchups here in the format that we know and love. Pudding, I'm ready to move up alongside Marco in 2.5. Pudding has some pretty good matchups in some of the top decks, and with the additions that it gets in the purple Big Mom Pirates cards in 11, it gets a lot of strengths and a lot of good pieces to help make the puzzle fit. It definitely doesn't surprise me here in the near future to see Pudding really excel, but I think there's just like 1 or 2 things something's really missing from it that people are going to have to crack the mold. I genuinely also think that Shanks is moving down into the tier 2.5, which is really weird to say because I think a lot of people will agree that here in post-ban OP10 in the West, Shanks is a really good deck, and rightfully so. But I think the problem with Shanks is not being able to compete with a lot of these other swarm decks that are going on, right? And also just decks that are 6k, right? Sure, you get to use your leader effect in order to make a 6,000 power leader 5 and only need to commit something like 1k counter, but that's still a card that you have to force out of your hand when you don't really have that much draw. Once some of the decks like green, purple, Luffy get going and really start to accelerate the game plan, it can be really difficult to battle those different characters that are on the field. I also think Kid goes down to 2.5. I don't have these specifically ordered in like, you know, Smoker's the best 2.5 deck or whatever. I'm just kind of throwing them in. I think Kid is only really going down because of some of the top decks that have entered, but is still one of the better yellow decks to exist in the game, right? Like Bello Betty is a counter pick to the top decks and maybe doesn't really do well against a lot of these other decks, but Kid I think has a more general good matchup spread across the format. It's just that these top decks right here are really populous. So yeah, these are it's tough. If we also want to talk about the fall off, it feels like purple Luffy almost goes down to tier 3. And this one, if I'm being honest, I can't really tell if it's just because Japanese players aren't playing the deck anymore, right? Or if the deck has just really fallen down. If you look at some of the weekend results and the top placement reports in OP11, purple Luffy is almost non-existent. Like there's even weeks when red green chopper has more placements than Pluffy. I think the fact that in order to ramp a lot of times Pluffy has to take its own life in comparison to one of its OP11 counterparts, which just has to play cards. I think kind of making yourself a pseudo 4 life, maybe 3 life leader just doesn't work in this format as well as it did in something like OP10, where you are a much more present deck. I also think I'm going to move Usopp into tier 3 as well, which is that's tough. I mean, the big joke about the ban list is that Usopp was the biggest loser, even though it didn't get hit, right? A lot of people feel like that Usopp just lost a lot of good matchups in the format, and I don't think it gets any help with the release of EBO2 and also OP11. I still know there's guys like Luigi Amato that are going to really hone in on this deck, but looking at the Western format, I don't really see it for Usopp. Now, some of the other points, I still think Lucci is a pretty good deck, and a lot of you are probably going to type in the comments and be really angry at that or be like, Jake, what do you mean? Rob Lucci has been a great counter pick to something like green purple Luffy, right? Having a pretty good matchup, being able to very easily just like delete a lot of those characters. And even with the loss of Gecko and Ice Age, I still think Lucci can consistently do what it wants to do, right? With Rebecca Hina combos, with also cards like Kaku, right, existing. Decks like green purple Luffy and one of the other top decks that we'll talk about don't really have protection effects like something in Smoker, for example, with that Toshigi. So I still think Rob Lucci is a good pick right now. This one I think is most likely going to bite me in the butt, but I am a believer still in that deck. I'll be the first to admit. I also still think Bonnie is a tier 2 deck in this format, just simply because your leader effect is really good, right? Being able to essentially negate an attack, or even in the early game be able to take out a card from the opponent's side of the field can be super valuable, and having different cards that work in your favor, like the 5-drop Cavendish, as well as stuff like 10-drop Doflamingo, just give it so many benefits to cause a lot of problems, right? It's okay if you boost up your leader to 6,000 or whatever, but does that really matter when your leader is frozen in rested? it's really interesting to see Bonnie in this format and how it stayed around as kind of the premier mono green deck. I don't know if I want to move any of these farther. I think maybe Trafalgar Law can go up into tier 3 because it's kind of in this category of like raw aggressive decks. I just don't know if it's better at it than Chopper, I'll be honest. But I think right there is probably where I would end at least the existing decks that are going on right now. So let's talk about OP11 leaders. I think starting off, Shirahoshi and Jinbei are just missing something. They're in the YouTube bait tier. I do like both of these leaders. I've watched some Japanese creators make some games on these two decks, and it's really exciting and fun to watch, and I think they're really, really unique in their own sense, right? Shirahoshi having the next saga of like the can't attack leader, and Jinbei being mono green, having different sets and Fishman Pirate cards already existing, kind of fit interestingly in the deck and can provide some issues to a lot of people if you don't know what's coming. But I think there's something missing. I also think there's kind of something missing in Nami and Kobe. I think they're both in that tier 3 category. Even though neither of them are really hit on the ban list, I think Kobe's just really missing something in the synergy kind of category, mostly because red and black are not two colors that mix well in general. Case in point, one of my favorite leaders, and then also Garp. But I think it's the best out of all the red-black leaders because they have started to build that synergy with the navy and sword types. There are some things that are pretty dangerous about this deck. There are some things that are pretty cool, especially because I don't think in the Kobe deck you needed the A Drop Gecko or Ice Age. They were great cards and you loved having them, but I think you're still in a little bit of cope at this point. Also, the Nami has been super underwhelming for a leader that was ultra hyped out the gate, right? So many people, especially, and maybe it was just the West that was saying this, I don't really know about the East, but a lot of people were saying that blue yellow Nami was going to be insane. It was going to be cracked. It was going to be a top deck, and it has been anything but that. It's been a little clunky, hasn't really been able to get out of some of these matchups, and has just not really had its time to shine as of yet. I also think at last second I'm going to move down Smoker and Red Purple Luffy into the tier 3 category. I haven't really seen results of them, and in theory, right, Smoker can do a lot of great things that Lucci can't in terms of trashing stuff like Jesus Burgess a lot earlier in that 5-cost Tashigi, which is pretty searchable with stuff like Branu and Sengoku draws. But I think the Ice Age ban really hits you a lot harder than Rob Lucci, and I think Smoker is going to struggle a little bit, even though the Gecko plays for Smoker were not as flexible as the plays as Rob Lucci. I feel like a lot of Smoker plays were value geckos, right? Being able to get Rebecca and 2K going. Maybe some draw with Sengoku. Red Purple Luffy, I think you're just outdone by a lot of the other leaders that ramp as well. Right? Green Purple Luffy kind of pushing you out as the multicolored Luffy in the format. But I think a deck that kind of joins the squeaker category in OP11 is Katakuri. So I really want to put this in the tier 2 category. I really think there's something there. It's honestly my favorite deck to come out of OP11 in terms of the leaders. And no, it's not just because I pulled the alternate art category during the opening that we had. Katakuri comes out as debatably the best mono purple deck in the format, being able to synergize really well with the Big Mom Pirates cards that we talked about accelerate putting in the meta. I highly recommend watching gameplay with this deck because it is so crazy. That 8-drop Katakuri that came in OP11 is huge in the set and can do so many good things. It's kind of wild restanding all those Big Mom Pirates. But the deck that I feel like moves up in tier 1, and probably if I'm going to order these two, I put this one first, Blue Purple Luffy. If you haven't heard of Blue Purple Luffy, I think it is the best deck to come out of the set and introduces itself as the best deck in format. Blue Purple Luffy is so consistent and so good, right? All it needs is a hyper aggressive find 2 ramp cards to get your leader effect off a turn early, and wouldn't you know, just have ultra consistency and finding something in the top 5 to grab, and then top deck as well, but also play Sanji, 9 costs, swarm the field with different insane bodies like the 9-drop Lin, right? Being able to heal a life, making you sort of a pseudo 4 to 5 life leader. That's base 6,000 power. It's incredible what this deck is doing right out of the gate, and I think these 2 decks in particular running the meta go alongside Gum Giant, which is why I maybe want to put Purple Luffy a little bit higher, but I'm going to hold it right here because I'm going to hold to what I say. This meta is really interesting, and especially with these 2 decks sometimes struggling against the hyper aggro, really give way to stuff like these 3 here at the bottom, and also Zoro and Bello Betty Stonks to go up. We're seeing a lot in the meta that sort of the top 4 placing decks within the format on a given weekend are these 2 right here and these 2 right here. It's really curious. I'm really interested to see how more Japan championships come out and evolve. And don't worry, we'll probably have some gameplay on some of these decks here soon on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you don't agree with in a civil and nice way. A lot of the daily video stuff is going to be coming on the channel this week, so be excited for that. I'm really excited. I'm going to do a lot of post-ban OP10 stuff, you know, kind of Pasadena Regionals prep and live streaming coming out this week as well. So hopefully you enjoy. Hopefully you are playing in OP10 and having a good time as I am, and hope to see you again soon.